right, let's jump into today's deep dive. We're taking a closer look at the new East Baltimore redevelopment project. A story that's been going on for like, what, 2 decades now?
Over 2 decades, yeah.
You always see those before and after pictures, like, the ones with the rundown blocks turned into all these fancy buildings. But we're going a bit deeper this time, especially with the whole biotech thing.
Yeah.
You guys requested we look into if that billion-dollar investment, actually made a difference.
Yeah.
Especially with that biotech boom that was promised. So.
Yeah. It's really interesting when you think back to the original vision back in 2003.
Okay.
It was a massive undertaking, 88 acres.
Wow.
They were going to build this state-of-the-art biotech park that would rival, like, the best in the world.
Oh, wow.
Thousands of jobs were supposed to be created, and there was so much excitement around it. Like, even the Greater Baltimore Committee, they raised $1 million right off the bat, just in startup funds.
$1 million. Right away. That's serious money. So if everyone was like so gung-ho about this, what happened?
Right.
I'm looking at the notes here, and it says there's only one biotech building, and it's not even full.
Yeah.
Doesn't exactly sound like the world-class biomedical district they were talking about, does it?
No, it doesn't. And then you have the University of Maryland Biopark to compare it to,
Right.
which got started later.
Okay.
But they've already got 3 buildings up and running.
Oh, wow.
And they've got more employees, higher occupancy rates.
Uh-huh.
It's kind of hard to ignore that, And while the national biotech market hasn't exactly been booming,
Right.
that can't be the only reason for the difference.
Yeah.
There's been a lot of talk about the rent at the East Baltimore building being way too high.
Oh, really?
There was even this company, Feudor Biotechnologies, and they specifically chose the Park because it was more affordable.
Interesting.
Yeah, they actually said the East Baltimore building had this a bad perception because of the cost.
So, not the best PR, huh? But let's back up for a sec. We're talking about a project worth $1.8 billion.
Mm-hmm.
$212 million of that was public money.
Yeah.
If they weren't building this, like, amazing biotech hub, where did all that money go?
Oh.
I mean, you said only 37% of the planned housing is built.
That's right. And this is where things get a little complicated. A big chunk of the funding came from HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development.
Okay.
And this wasn't just a regular loan. It came with some very specific conditions, especially tied to job creation.
So this is where the whole jobs debacle comes in, right?
Yeah.
They initially promised, what, 4,000 jobs?
Yeah, 4,000 initially.
And then they bumped it up to...
Well, they increased it later.
Okay.
Somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000.
Those were supposed to be the jobs that would, like, really make a difference for the community,
Yeah.
So the big question is, where are those jobs?
Right, that's the big question. I mean, EBDI, the nonprofit in charge of the project, they say the economic downturn had a big impact, but even their own reports show far fewer jobs than they promised. And a lot of them were just temporary construction jobs.
Oh, so not really the kind of sustainable long-term employment they promised.
Exactly. And that HUD loan we talked about?
Yeah.
It specifically stated that 7,750 of those jobs were supposed to be from the biotech park.
1,750. Wow.
That obviously hasn't happened.
This is starting to sound like a bit of a bait-and-switch situation. Promise all these jobs to get the funding, and then...
Well, it's complicated, but I can see why people are upset.
Yeah.
Those jobs, especially in biotech,
Right.
they were supposed to have a lasting impact, change people's lives.
Especially for the, 732 households that had to move.
Mm-hmm.
And the 669 buildings that were demolished.
Yeah.
All to make way for this grand plan,
Yeah.
Can you imagine being told you have to leave your home,
Right.
your community, for all of this?
It definitely raises a lot of ethical questions.
Yeah.
Was it really necessary to just demolish an entire neighborhood? What about the people who lost their homes, their communities, their history?
Right. Yeah.
There are people who are calling it ethnic cleansing, American style.
Wow. So it's not just about the money. It's a potential social and ethical problem, too.
Yeah.
Okay, so we've talked about the big vision,
Right.
the biotech park struggles,
Right.
and all those missing jobs.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's more to the story. What's going on with the project now?
Well, there's been a major shift. They're moving away from biotech.
Oh, really?
And now they're focusing more on commercial development, like a hotel, restaurants, things like that.
Really? That's quite a change. But is that like a sign of failure? Or are they just, adapting?
Well,
And where does all of this leave the community? The community that was supposed to benefit from this whole thing? I guess that's a story for our next dive.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll get into that next time.
Yeah, it really is a major shift, and it makes you wonder, what does success even look like for this project? But, before we get into that, I think we really need to hear from the people who are actually affected by all of this.
Yeah, that's a good point. We've been throwing around like billions of dollars and these huge plans,
Right.
but at the end of the day, it's people's lives we're talking about.
Exactly.
So who are the main players here? And what are they saying about all this? The successes, the failures of this whole new East Baltimore project.
Well, the group that's been in the center of it all is EBDI,
EBDI.
East Baltimore Development, Inc.
Okay.
They've been running the show since the beginning.
So they're the ones handling, like, everything.
Pretty much. Buying the land, moving people, overseeing the construction,
Okay.
the whole 9 yards.
But they've also been getting a lot of criticism, haven't they?
Oh, absolutely. People feel like they haven't been transparent enough.
Like keeping secrets.
Well, more like not really involving the community in the decisions. And there are worries about whether they've really done enough for the people who were forced to move.
So what do they have to say about all that? What's EBD's response?
Well, their leaders say they're committed to revitalizing East Baltimore. And they say they are making progress, even if it's slower than they originally thought.
Slower than they thought, huh?
They point to the investments that have been made, the new infrastructure,
Right.
and they talk about the partnerships they've built.
I've got a quote here from Christopher Shea. He's EBDI's CEO.
Okay.
He said, "Look at us here today, in the midst of what is probably the worst recession any of us will ever see, celebrating a $60 million investment." Sounds like he's trying to spin things in a positive light, even with the economy being so rough.
Yeah, that quote was from a groundbreaking ceremony for a new graduate student housing tower at Johns Hopkins.
Oh, what?
Graduate student housing.
That wasn't part of the original plan, was it?
No, it wasn't. Shea was basically saying that even with the recession, the project was still moving forward and attracting investment.
Graduate student housing.
Yeah.
I wonder if the people who were forced out of their homes would consider that a win. Is this really helping the community, or are they just like focusing on a different group of people now?
That's a really good question. It gets to the core of what we're talking about here.
Right.
This whole debate about the project's changing priorities.
Okay.
Some people argue that the student housing is needed to bring in new residents and investment,
Sure.
but others say it's proof that they've lost sight of that original goal.
You mean creating a mixed income community that benefits everyone?
Exactly.
Yeah, it seems like there's a lot of disagreement about what revitalization actually means. And speaking of different perspectives, we can't ignore the elephant in the room here. Johns Hopkins.
Right.
They're a major player in all of this, aren't they?
Absolutely. Johns Hopkins Hospital is like the anchor institution in the area. They've been involved since the very beginning.
They see it as a chance to, help the community, right?
Yeah. Improve health and well-being. They've put a lot of money into the project.
But it hasn't been all smooth sailing, has it?
Not exactly.
There's some pretty strong criticism in these articles. Some people are even accusing Johns Hopkins of putting their own interests ahead of the community's.
There are definitely concerns. People are worried that they're more interested in expanding their campus and making the area more affluent.
Like gentrifying it.
Yeah, essentially. There's a quote from a professor at Morgan State University that really stuck with me. He said, "They want it to look like Charles Village."
Charles Village?
It's that wealthy neighborhood right next to Johns Hopkins Homewood campus.
Ah, I see. So they're worried the project will end up pushing out the current residents and creating this community that caters mostly to students and faculty, people connected to the university.
Exactly.
So what does Johns Hopkins have to say about all this? Are they even acknowledging these criticisms?
Well, their president, Ronald J. Daniels, he's defended the project. He says it's necessary to address the huge problems facing the community.
Like what kind of problems?
Poverty, crime, health issues. He believes the redevelopment will bring in the investment and resources that the area desperately needs.
So they're basically saying it's tough love. They're doing this for the community's own good.
In a way, yes. They're saying it's a necessary intervention.
But you could argue that the project itself has made some of those problems worse, right? Especially with all the demolition and displacement.
That's a really important point, and it highlights this tension that's at the heart of so many urban redevelopment projects.
What do you mean?
It's this constant struggle between wanting progress,
Right.
but also needing to protect the communities that already exist. It's a tough balance to find.
Yeah, it sounds like the new East Baltimore project is really struggling with that.
It is.
Okay, so we've talked about EBDI, the nonprofit running things. We've talked about Johns Hopkins
Yeah.
with all their influence.
Right.
But what about the city itself? Where does the city of Baltimore fit into all of this?
Well, the city has been a major player from the start. They approved the project, they put in a lot of public money. They saw it as a way to revitalize a struggling neighborhood, attract investment,
Sure.
make the city better overall.
But there must be a lot of pressure on them to show that all this investment was worth it, especially with all the controversy surrounding the project.
Oh, absolutely. And there are definitely different opinions about whether the city has done enough to make sure the project benefits the people who already live there.
Right, yeah.
Some critics say the city hasn't held the developers accountable for their promises.
Especially about affordable housing and jobs.
Exactly. There's this quote from a city councilman, Carl Stokes, that really captures this sentiment. He said, "They don't have a vision. Housing is not their primary focus there. Dislocation, not relocation."
Yeah, that's pretty harsh.
It is, and it reflects this wider concern that the project has been more about tearing things down and building new stuff than about taking care of the people who are already living there.
Yeah.
Like, the city's been too focused on the big picture, attracting investment, making the area look better,
Right.
without really considering the human cost of those changes.
It sounds like there's a lot of finger pointing going on.
Oh, yeah.
Everyone blaming everyone else for the project's problems.
It's a mess.
But what about the people who were most affected by all of this? What are the residents saying about their experiences?
That's where things get really personal.
Right.
You really see the true cost of these decisions. And we've got some powerful quotes from residents that really bring this home.
I'd love to hear them. What are some of the things they've said?
One resident who was forced to move said something that really stuck with me. They said, "Money can't buy you the house your grandmother left you when she came up from the South. Once they tear down the house, you can never go back."
Oh, wow. It's heartbreaking. You can really feel the loss and the disruption in that statement.
Right.
It's not just about losing a house. It's about losing a connection to your family's history, your community,
Exactly.
your sense of belonging.
It highlights the human side of all this, the cost of redevelopment that often gets ignored.
Yeah, it sounds like for a lot of residents, the new East Baltimore project has felt like being kicked out of their own community.
That's a good way to put it. And that feeling of betrayal is probably even worse because so many of the promises that were made to them,
About jobs, affordable housing, a better community.
all of that, it just hasn't happened.
It's like they were sold this dream of a better future,
Yeah,
and then it turned into something completely different.
it did.
It sounds like a lot of residents feel like their voices weren't heard at all.
That's a common feeling.
They were told this project was for their benefit, but it doesn't seem like they were included in the decisions, or that anyone really listened to their concerns.
No, it doesn't. And that feeling comes from a history of broken promises and a lack of transparency.
From the developers, from the city.
From both, really.
Yeah.
There's this sense that everything was decided behind closed doors.
Without any real input from the community.
Exactly. The articles mentioned a community group, SMEAC, the Save Middle East Action Committee.
SMEC, right? They were against the project, weren't they?
They argued that the demolition was way too much.
Great.
And they said the project would end up benefiting outsiders more than the people who already live there. And they were really vocal about the lack of community involvement in the planning.
So what happened to them? Did they manage to change anything?
Well, they eventually disbanded, but their concerns about displacement, gentrification, the lack of community input, those are still very relevant.
Right.
Their activism showed just how much mistrust there was between the residents and the developers, and that mistrust is still there today.
Okay, so we have a project that hasn't lived up to its promises. We have residents who feel betrayed and displaced,
Right.
and this deep mistrust between the community and the people in power. It's not exactly a happy story. So is any hope for this new East Baltimore project? Can it still achieve its goals even with all the changes? Or is it too late?
That's the question we need to answer, isn't it?
Yeah.
The future of the new East Baltimore project is still up in the air, and this story is going to keep unfolding for years to come.
Yeah, it's definitely complicated. So where do we go from here? What's next for this new East Baltimore project? Can it still, revitalize the community? Or is it too late for that?
Well, that's the big question, isn't it? And to be honest, I don't think there's a simple answer. But we can look at what they're doing now for some clues. Like you said, they're moving away from the biotech focus
Right.
and pushing more for commercial development, hotels, restaurants.
Yeah, but I'm still not sure about that. Does building a hotel and some places to eat really solve the problems? Will that bring the kind of change they were talking about at the beginning? And what about the people who live there? Are they involved in these new plans at all?
That's the thing. The articles we looked at don't really say.
No.
And after everything that's happened, all the broken promises, that's not a good sign, is it?
No, not really. But there is one quote that's been on my mind. It's from a Baltimore developer, David Cordish.
Okay.
He said, "You have 40,000 workers there at the hospital. That's your engine, and you have cleared land. As a developer, you look for an anchor that isn't going anywhere. And Hopkins Hospital is the anchor."
That's an interesting take. Cordish isn't actually involved in the project himself,
Right.
but he seems to think the location still has potential.
Even though the whole biotech thing didn't work out.
Yeah. His argument is that with Johns Hopkins Hospital there, they can still attract businesses and, make it a desirable place to be, revitalize the area in a different way.
So maybe it's not a complete failure then.
Maybe not, but there are some big ifs here.
Like what?
The developers really need to work with the community this time,
Actually listen to them.
be honest about their plans, and they need to put the needs of the people who have lived there all along first. The city needs to step up too.
Make sure everyone benefits.
Exactly, not just a select few.
So it sounds like the future of the project is still uncertain. There's potential, but there are also these, open wounds that need to be healed.
Yeah, that's a good way to put it. And that's what makes this whole story so interesting. It shows how complicated urban redevelopment really is.
Yeah.
The stakes are high. There are no guarantees. It's about trying to find that balance between progress and preserving what's already there, between economics and ethics.
So what does this all mean for our listeners? Well, it means this project is a case study. It's worth keeping an eye on.
Yeah.
It raises important questions about how we develop our cities responsibly, the impact on communities,
Absolutely.
and how to create urban spaces that are truly fair and equitable.
It makes you think, are fancy new buildings enough? Or does real revitalization require something more? And if we look at the bigger picture, this is happening in cities all over the country. We're dealing with gentrification, affordability, economic growth.
Right.
We need to learn from projects like this one.
The good and the bad.
Exactly.
Here's something to think about. Can a project like this ever be considered a success if it changes so much from what it was supposed to be? If they create this lively, mixed-use community, but it doesn't achieve those original goals, is that enough? Or does true success mean being committed to social justice and empowering the community?
Those are tough questions.
They are. And we encourage you to keep thinking about them as this story continues to unfold.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive.
It's been a challenging conversation,
Yeah.
but definitely an important one. So until next time, keep asking those questions, keep learning, and keep diving deep.